In the early 60s, Vancouver was a sleepy little provincial center going nowhere slowly. In many ways, it epitomized the British in British Columbia. It was courteous and colonial with very few problems and even fewer ambitions. There was still an air of the 50s around. Tourism was basically non-existent, and the city languished in its Pacific isolation.
You know, as Al Fotheringham described it when he was a columnist at the Vancouver Sun, he said Vancouver was the most beautiful setting in the world in search of a city. It was part of a whole series of people right across the political spectrum who were tired of this, you know, smug, provincial, tight-ass town, if I can use, I think, an accurate description of what the city was like until that period.
At the time, Mike Harcourt was a storefront lawyer working with kids in Gastown.
Trying to keep kids alive, basically, kids who were on bad drugs, tainted acid, taking heroin and speed at the same time.
As the 60s matured, Canada celebrated its centennial with a World's Fair, Expo 67. But as thousands of young Canadians were taking excursions to Montreal to visit Expo, their American counterparts were embarking on much more sinister tours. The war in Vietnam sparked an unprecedented protest movement that exploded in the 1967 Summer of Love. At last, the 60s had arrived. It was a time of flower power, free love, and expensive ideals. The kids were hippies, the police were pigs, and the air was heavy with marijuana smoke and rehashed socialist rhetoric.
I've gone along with your, the word hippie so far, and we would have to stop at this point and try to say what a hippie is, and this would take a great deal of time because my idea of a hippie and Vancouver Sun's idea of a hippie and somebody on 4th Avenue's idea of a hippie would probably be completely different things.
The 60s movement in North America was a West Coast phenomenon, and almost overnight, Vancouver became Canada's San Francisco, a mecca for legions of disaffected youth, pilgrims of protest. A new generation demanded a voice, and they found it in Vancouver in a little underground newspaper called the Georgia Straight.
In February and March of '67, suddenly this hippie phenomenon started, and people started coming to Vancouver, and there was the first Easter Bien was formulated then, and so we became a part of all of that and gave expression to it in the first issue of the paper.
The first issue hit the streets on May 5th, 1967. It cost a dime, and no one could have predicted on that typically wet spring morning that the Georgia Straight was destined to become the most prosecuted newspaper in Canada's history. The Cecil Hotel at the north end of the Granville Street Bridge is now a peeler bar. But in 1967, it was a hotbed of aspiring intellectuals, dissidents, and vagabonds. It was here that a young UBC math student and poet, Dan McLeod, with a small group of friends, conspired to commit journalism on their own terms.
The Georgia Straight could not have happened anywhere else. Nothing quite like the Georgia Straight would have occurred anywhere else. And I think the reason for that has a lot to do with the political culture of British Columbia. It is a peculiar political culture that allows people to kind of reshape or think about remaking the world in their own image and likeness.
What we were saying in terms of protest was being squelched from the very beginning. The hotline talk shows were abuzz with the anti-hippie thing, and we became immediately identified with all these people on the streets that were taking over the city. There was a movement, an official movement to stop the paper. The prosecutor was scouring the law books to find ways of getting rid of us. The mayor was being petitioned by individuals to do something about this paper.
Their vision was a free press, a clarion call for the counterculture. The Georgia Strait was born, and immediately the city declared battle stations.
Nobody in Vancouver would print it. We had to take a truck and drive over to Victoria and get it printed. So it was amazing what we had to go through to get a paper on the streets.
While selling issue number 1 on the street, McLeod was arrested and thrown in jail on suspicion of vagrancy. It was a harbinger of things to come. In the first few weeks of its life, the Strait attacked the police force, crucified City Hall and its councillors, fought censorship, and promoted numerous environmental causes. The mainstream press and the city fathers were appalled.
On the recommendation of myself, Corporation Council, and Note Herald, in our opinion, this paper is not a fit publication to be distributed in the city of Vancouver.
Mayor Tom Campbell saw the Strait as an abomination and McLeod as public enemy number 1. Campbell was a devoted family man and a deeply religious lawyer and real estate developer. His resolve to rid the city of this scurrilous rag knew no bounds.
Suddenly, street vendors started getting all the papers seized by the police, and the police were just seizing them en masse on the streets, and we had 700 street vendors out there, so with papers, and 60,000 papers, and they seized over 30,000 of them.
Well, the council isn't prepared to censor the Georgia Strait. The license inspector suspended the license for gross misconduct, and that's something you can't clean up. I don't think that these are the type of people that we want publishing papers in Vancouver.
Well, I never could figure out when he said that what's wrong with this city is it's full of pinkos, communists, and hamburgers. And I didn't know which of those 3 I was.
This was a rag that was being pushed to school children at 15 cents a copy. It was bread for the hippies and was profit for the publishers, and we just couldn't tolerate it any longer.
His ultimate political nirvana was being on the front page of the Sun and Province on the same day. That to him was political nirvana. And he was part of an old-style council that was ready to be kicked out.
Obscenity was a favorite of theirs because obscenity is something that the public can kind of get behind and be against. One of the few things that they could bust us for and get some public sympathy. So they kept doing it again and again.
Too bad that you had to get caught. That's not like you to lose face.
Soon it was bust after bust after bust. 9 different prosecutions in 1 month alone. Obscenity was the most common charge, but the Strait was hit with 3 counts of inciting to commit an indictable offense for an article on how to grow marijuana, and a much more serious charge of criminal libel for ridiculing a judge.
Bob Cummings wrote a column after Stan Persky was convicted of loitering in front of the courthouse fountain. The judge said that while he might not agree with the law, he felt that he was obliged by the law to convict him. So we awarded the judge the Pontius Pilate Certificate of Justice, proving that justice is not only blind, but deaf, dumb, and stupid.
It wasn't what people today would consider a big, heavy drug culture center, but I don't think there were very many people there who didn't smoke the odd joint at least.
At one point, local DJ Fred Latrimo joined the paper as co-editor.
I'd like to make this really clear. I have had, at this stage, no involvement with the Georgia Strait, except on a minor basis, being friends with the editor, and I'm my co-editor now, Dan McLeod, who I think at this stage I might say has probably been the most misunderstood man of the last 3 months. A couple of the 4-letter words which appeared in the Georgia Strait, which everybody became so terribly shocked about,
were in context in two of the Beatles interviews which we had.
There was a cartoon of a dog peeing on the fire hydrant. There was a classified ad that mentioned the word muff diving, that kind of thing, but we'd be hit with obscenity all the time.
Ironically, it was that obscenity charge that would save the paper when the city managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory by prosecuting what became the famous muff diving case.
Where they were charged with publishing one of those personal ads. And a young fellow, 32 years old, wanted to meet a nice young lady, object muff diving.
I referred to the question of muff diving as the judgment shows that I hadn't even heard about it. I heard about it afterwards, but I didn't even know what that meant at that time.
The judge said, if the word doesn't exist, it can't be obscene. I don't know what it means. The charge is thrown out.
That was a turning point for us. Here's one judge that stood up and said that this is ridiculous, and threw the case out.
But McLeod wasn't out of the woods yet. At its Gastown offices, a new onslaught soon hit the paper, this time from within.
We're upset because we've been fighting this sexism for 2 years with the straight. We've had constant arguments with them. The women on the staff have fought quite hard to stop pictures like this going in and ads in the personal column. And this is just the last straw.
The purpose actually is to get the control of the paper in the hands of the people who actually put the paper out.
The whole idea of putting a newspaper out almost in defiance of all the rules. We had everybody on us. We had, I mean, you knew about the mayor, you knew about the police, you knew about the old crusty reactionaries who just didn't ever want to see another issue of the Straight. But there was a lot, there were even internal hassles. And that got to the point sometimes where there was actual shouting and screaming in the newsroom.
Once again, McLeod weathered the storm. The city was now preparing to move up to the bigger leagues. In 1970, the Canucks played their first game at the Pacific Coliseum against Los Angeles. They lost, although few Straight readers even noticed. The next year, a multi-million-dollar redevelopment of Gastown was sidelined when police clashed with 2,000 hippies at a smoke-in to protest drug busts. The Gastown riot made national news, and many blamed the Straight for inciting it.
It's what radicalized people like Art Phillips and Ed Sweeney, who were on the council then, when they were pushed into a doorway by the crowd and a mounted policeman came by and said, you move out of that doorway and you're going to regret it, or words to that effect, right? And they said, hold it, we're members of council. Well, we don't give a shit who we are. You know, you get the same treatment. And the Straight was full, you know, right in the middle of all the mischief around that, publicizing it and talking about marijuana and whether it should be legal or illegal.
After the first tumultuous years, with legal fees outstripping production costs, the Straight seemed doomed to fold and fade into history. The 60s era didn't end with the decade, and Vancouver was still attracting a colorful assortment of renegades from all over the world. One of them would play a critical role in ensuring the Straight's survival, an eccentric young Irishman named Bob Geldof. In the early 70s, the paper was barely clinging to life. McLeod was in serious need of help. It arrived when an illegal immigrant walked in the door of 56A Powell Street.
Well, it wasn't Bob Geldof, it was actually Rob Geldof. And I never knew exactly why, but I think it had something to do with immigration. But anyway, he came in looking for a job. Only job we had was working in the back room, stripping covers off of magazines, distribution. So he worked for a while doing that, and then somebody mentioned that he could write, so, oh, Geldof can write, you know.
And I said, well, I'm working here at the moment, but I've been a journalist, a music journalist in England, which was a complete lie. And I said, look, I'll take the pictures and I'll write up some things on local bands. If you don't like it, don't publish it, you know.
Later, he became leader of the Boomtown Rats and creator of Live Aid. But while in Vancouver, Geldof brought an almost messianic zeal to the paper. He wrote, photographed, and edited. He also organized benefits for the Legal Defense Fund and brought record companies on board as advertisers, while still finding time for some serious drinking at the Old Anchor Hotel.
Because the Straight had no fear of favors with anyone, you could essentially write what you like. And so I did. And no one bothered me, you know, and it was predicated on the fact that it would work, you know. If it didn't work, then you moved on to something else. And, you know, you were allowed to do this, and this immense freedom.
Probably one of the most energetic people and dedicated workers who ever worked at the Straight.
You know, but the thing about Bob was, I guess, you know, he was what, you know, like he became famous for being the mouth, right? And one of the reasons the English music media loved him was he was so mouthy, and he's really outspoken, didn't care, and he made it quite clear that the only reason he couldn't care less for most of the music he was sent to review or cover, and he didn't like most of the people, and he thought a lot of them were just basically stupid. So his whole thing was that this is how I eat, this is where my clothes come from, this is where I get the free drinks.
And while I may be mouthy, I tend as much as possible to back it up. I tend to put my money where my mouth is, you know. I mean, if I say I'll do something, I'll do it.
With or without McLeod's permission, Geldof changed the Straight's focus from politics to music. He pioneered a new form of writing, rock journalism, of which Frank Zappa commented, "It's people who can't write, interviewing people who can't talk, for the sake of people who can't read."
There was no reason why a local underground paper didn't cover not just the local political scene, but the music scene. And so I started writing in a way I'd seen the English music press begin to start writing in. As the big acts came into town, we were, in effect, the only music mag in town. You could get reviews from the big papers, but we were the only ones who could carry it in depth. We thought that if we had a really good music section with really good writers and really good photographs and an excellent reviews section, a comprehensive record reviews section, I thought it would appeal to people who would normally be alienated by the paper.
Case in point of self-indulgency was in the brief time that I was editor, I put myself on the cover, which doesn't happen anymore, believe me.
Straight District Manager Nick Collier became good friends with Geldof.
Geldof used to make up a lot of things about the music industry. His random notes, he originated this column called Random Notes, and a lot of it was BS. He'd just make it up as he went along, but it was hilarious. He went to interview Kiss, you know, and it was the first time, as I recall, that anybody had seen Kiss without any makeup on. And they actually let us take pictures during the interview, but the problem was we didn't have any money to pay for the film or the tape, so the camera had no film in it, and the tape recorder had no tape in it.
Dan and I had been on some adventures, and Nick and I, and you know, we'd snuck into the United States because Dan was persona non grata, and I had no visas for Canada or the States, and we'd, you know, gone in this van and gone down to LA and stuff like that, San Francisco. And
I think Dan's greatest strength and greatest weakness is his management style, right? It's a weakness when he doesn't pick the right editor or executive editor or whatever, and steps away from the responsibility of doing it, and you've got to deal with this donut head, right? But that's also a strength when you have guys like, I mean, when you pick Geldof as editor, I mean, there was a guy who, I mean, literally loved doing what he was doing, and the paper was the main concern, right?
Undaunted, Geldof went gonzo long before the style became synonymous with the Rolling Stone.
I got a stylistics album to review, and I just put, this is shite, was the review as far as I remember. That was it. I just couldn't be bothered anymore writing about why it was crap. It's just, it's crap. And the review was the stylistics, so-and-so, and I just put, this is shite, next, you know, wrote on there. And someone wrote in, some outraged stylistics fan, you know, float on, or whatever that awful music was. And they said, well, if you think you can do better, why don't you just go and do it? And so I did.
Geldof left the Strait and Canada at the request of the Immigration Department. Today, he is Sir Bob Geldof to millions and one of Britain's most treasured celebrities.
I left suddenly because I'd only entered on a 2-week visa, and no one had asked me in the paper for my social security stuff, though I was, going about the roundabout route of getting, dodgy papers, in order to enable me to stay. And I was seconds away from the police knocking on my door. I mean, I knew that because I'd been told.
One way or another, he had to go, and I don't think he really wanted to go, but I think he had to go. His immigration had run out, and so it was too bad.
But I'll certainly always remember it with deep affection, as the sort of launch platform of my life, not of my career, but of my life, for a crowd of people who managed to put up with me and let me get on with it.
In Vancouver, a green revolution was underway. A small circle of straight columnists and their friends had decided to form an environmental group. When Greenpeace was born, it was a home delivery, and the Strait was the midwife.
I think the Strait was absolutely integral to the development of Greenpeace. It gave voice to the growth of a movement that, while it was attracting media attention in the mainstream press, the Strait provided the depth and the continuity of coverage of Greenpeace issues and reached out to the section of the public that was most receptive to that message.
The Georgia Strait took the issues that people who were drawn to Greenpeace took those issues seriously, took those questions seriously. It took a lot of the rest of society a couple of decades to kind of catch up to that.
At its inception, Greenpeace was strictly an anti-nuclear movement, but its leaders soon found themselves in troubled waters. Vicious infighting produced more Trotskys than Lenins, and the new manifesto became Save the Whales.
Well, Bob Cummings was covering a lot of environmental issues, and his column became stronger and stronger voice and supporter. A lot of it came out of the Strait, because it was one of the things that the dailies were not really covering very well.
The man that did more for Greenpeace and the Strait during those turbulent years was the late Bob Cummings.
The police would characteristically come into the place every 2 or 3 days, walk around looking intimidating, asking people's names, making veiled threats. I remember the first time I was stopped in the street and searched. I'd never been used to that sort of thing, and the idea of having to lean against a car on Granville Street, having people go through your pockets, police go through your pockets, have people go by looking at you like, what kind of criminal is this?
A brilliant and fearless writer, and an inspiration to a whole new breed of Strait contributors, Cummings also had a unique understanding of Dan McLeod.
McLeod's leadership is rather like the action of waves rather than a bulldozer. If a bulldozer hits a piece of rock, it may get through or break down. McLeod is kind of an ongoing action. I can remember the various disputes of the paper. He's just always there, and he keeps lapping away at it in his own quiet way till he basically wears down the opposition, whatever it is, and gets his own way.
It was no coincidence that the Strait played such a pivotal role in the evolution of Greenpeace. From its first issue, the paper had campaigned for myriad so-called green causes. Its list of firsts in ecological and conservationist concerns is unparalleled by any newspaper in the world.
Well, this is the environment. It's outside. I don't know what else the environment is. But it's about the whole idea of the way human societies might coexist with animal populations, whether they be whales or fish or birds, and the way cities might actually occur within the natural landscape instead of simply imposing itself upon and obliterating the natural landscape. These are ideas that were considered radical 30 years ago. I think they're ideas that guide and govern most public policy decisions today. The Georgia Strait knew that 30 years ago. The Georgia Strait knows that today.
The Strait can still be counted on to cover the issues that the mainstream press isn't covering. Not all the time, not every issue we'd like to see in print, but generally speaking, for the environmental movement as a whole, the Georgia Strait is a really good outlet for the information that we're trying to convey.
During this period, the Strait was also nurturing a stable of talent, poised to break through on the national scene.
Earlier today, the Honorable Mr. Bennett called on me and tendered his resignation.
In August 1972, BC's first NDP government under Dave Barrett began a 1,200-day reign. Nothing was soak-red anymore. It also marked the Strait's darkest hours. Cashing a paycheck became a weekly nightmare.
There was a time, there's no such thing as a cash flow of the Georgia Strait. It was, you know, it was a flash flood. You know, the money would come in and would be gone in 15 seconds. You know, I mean, if I wanted to get paid, I would follow Dan down to the bank. In fact, I even had a relationship happening with one of the bank tellers. She would call me up. Tom, there's money.
But you always knew when the checks were going to bounce because he wouldn't be there. You know, you'd get your check in an envelope and you'd go, oh, is Dan around? You know, oh, he's not here. Well...
For the next 5 years, the paper survived, not only because of McLeod's business acumen, but thanks to the totally selfless dedication of a handful of staffers with exceptional loyalty to the Strait's vision.
Get the name and... Yeah, get the name in here.
I think the paper wasn't selling that well. He was going through a lot of court battles at the time, you know, so that every time a lawyer demanded a retainer, you know, we'd look at each other, me and Grant, and go, uh-oh, okay, it's porridge next week. And it's almost that theory of last man standing, you know, who's the greatest person in the world? Oh, the last man standing, you know. And I think that's what Dan is. I mean, you could criticize the paper for different time periods, you know, and you can go in and out of it, liking one year or hating the next year or whatever, but the fact he survived, and now, I mean, he's starting to win some journalist awards, I hear, so, I mean, you know, he must be doing something right.
Well, you say that this story was suppressed, but...
This adversity forged some of the strongest talents to emerge from the Strait's pages.
Every time there was a big decision to be made, everybody would talk it out, and then everybody would look to Dan for the final answer, and he wouldn't be there. We were all thumbing our noses at various kinds of establishment, not the establishment, cap T-E, but every time we found anybody or anything that we thought was too puffed up and full of itself, or anybody who was too puffed up and full of themselves, we would go after them with harpoons.
Brent Boates is one of Hollywood's most sought-after art directors. He was nominated for an Academy Award for his work on the Bruce Willis mega-hit Die Hard, and he struck gold when he designed the famous Ghostbusters logo. Boates got his start at the Strait.
Through the Strait, you know, doing comics in the Strait, I got a job at the film board, and then and that led to a job on a feature film, and then I moved to Montreal and worked on that, and then met people and worked on a picture that got picked up by Hollywood, and went to Hollywood.
Dee Lippingwell is Canada's leading concert photographer. Her pictures capture the elusive essence of performance at its rawest and most revealing. She developed her skills at the Strait through Bob Geldof.
I got into the Strait by actually going down and badgering them to death. Bob Geldof was the art director at the time, and I took a whole bunch of pictures to Bob Geldof, and he said, no, you're not good enough yet. You're not good enough yet. And so then I'd wait a couple of months and I'd take more stuff into him. No, you're not good enough yet. Just keep trying, keep trying. I was busting my behind.
Dee finally got hired, but the day she reported for work, Geldof had left the country. Then she experienced Strait syndrome.
And I remember going and sitting in Dan's office, right, mid stacks and piles of paper, saying, Dan, I'm not leaving here till you pay me. Like, I'm not leaving here till you pay me. When Bob Geldof left the Strait and went back to England, formed the Boomtown Rats, came back to Vancouver to play the Commodore, I was backstage. And he looked at me, and because I had seen him 3 or 4 times, he looked at me and he said, oh, they did hire you. They did hire you. That's good. That's good.
Before he formed Doug and the Slugs in 1978, Doug Bennett had been the art director at the Straight for 5 years. Bennett was also a gifted cartoonist who worked under the nom de plume Craig.
As to using nom de plumes, or as we call them, aliases, the first reason was so that the unemployment insurance wouldn't run out. But I think more importantly, it was to make the paper look like it wasn't being put out by 3 people. And the graphics guys were always kind of the grunts, you know, the infantry. You know, they never get recognized, and they never get mentioned in that 30-year book. That's another bone I got to pick, Dan.
I guess I got there at the time when they were just beginning to think that they wanted to change their image and everything from a hippie rag and a radical, you know, kind of thing to more, not say to more of an entertainment-oriented thing, but to what I guess Dan's idea of a free press should be.
Another emerging talent was music critic Tom Harrison.
And because, I mean, the writing had so much energy, which I kind of, you know, like, but at the same time, no discipline. And that was, I think, typical of the Georgia Straight anyways. I mean, if you were a writer, you had ideas. If you had energy and you were willing to work for practically nothing, then you could write at the Georgia Straight. And that.
In November of 1978, the Sun and the province went on strike. The Pacific Press dailies were pillars of the establishment and had long regarded the Straight as cheap trash. But as the strike stretched from weeks into months, some of the daily's best writers defected to the Straight.
They literally would refer to us as the Hippy Rag in, you know, in their headlines, so it's very antagonistic. There was no love lost between us, and I guess that's the same today. They're our chief competitor, the dailies.
During a previous Pacific Press strike in 1967, McLeod had actually tried to turn the Straight into a daily itself. It was a capricious move that produced exactly one issue. Today, only this copy survives, perhaps because it was the only edition of the Straight ever to feature stock market listings. As the soulless 70s came to an end, Vancouver was experiencing dramatic change. Kitsilano, the spiritual heart of the paper, was being rapidly gentrified. IKEA bookshelves replaced bricks and boards, and the sweet odor of marijuana smoke and patchouli oil drifted towards the city's poorer East End.
I think the biggest reason so many people went through that paper and left was the fact that there was no money, you know. Working conditions were horrible. But, you know, when you're 20, I mean, you don't care stepping over a passed-out junkie. You know, it's kind of like, oh, look, culture.
The Straight was caught in a time warp. Hopelessly out of step with the current trends, it was, for the first time in history, beginning to look old-fashioned. In the early 80s, the city was in high gear. In April 1982, Premier Bill Bennett announced Vancouver would host Expo 86. The party was just beginning.
It's full steam ahead with Expo and the government.
There were also signs of a new industry emerging, one that would turn Vancouver into the third largest film and television production center in North America. At the Straight, McLeod was preparing plans for one last-ditch effort to save the paper.
Exclusive. All of it. Because nobody else wanted it.
On September 10th, 1982, a landmark edition of the Straight came off the presses, the first free issue. McLeod had calculated that by giving the paper away, he would control the circulation and more effectively predict ad revenues. It was a bold move, but if it didn't work, it would be game over after 15 grueling years.
It was a real struggle. It was, the paper could have knocked it over with a feather many times. We used to joke about how hard the city would try to put us under, you know, to get the police out and seize the papers and take us to jail and all this. And, you know, little did they know the points when they really could have knocked us off so easily.
At the same time, McLeod drastically altered the editorial policy. There would be no news coverage whatsoever. The Straight would be nothing more than an entertainment weekly.
I had a strict ban on news for many, many years because I felt that that's what really got us in trouble, is when we started giving opinions. That's when the city would come down on us. And so as long as we stick to entertainment, which was a real strong point at that time, as long as we stuck to entertainment, then we could build from that and eventually make the whole thing whole again.
Many of its avid readers saw this move as a complete sellout and an abdication of everything the Straight had stood for. Now a free press meant simply that you didn't have to pay for it.
I think that one of the biggest reasons for the Straight's success is its painstaking attention to circulation and distribution, making sure that the papers are picked up, making sure that they're picked up fast.
Despite its many critics, Expo 86 turned out to be a resounding success. Vancouver welcomed the world, and the world had a ball. The city became firmly established as one of the most vital and vibrant centers on the Pacific Rim. Although to many Vancouverites, Expo's most lingering legacy is that you can now drink on Sundays.
The Straight has outlasted Tom Campbell and the hippies, and is soon to outlast Ronald Reagan and the yuppies.
McLeod's gamble was beginning to pay off. The Straight's circulation and revenues were at last on the incline, and survival was taking a back seat to success.
To the Georgia Straight. That's cool with no regrets.
When Premier Vander Zalm sold the Expo lands to Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing, a new chapter was being written in the history of the city and the Georgia Strait.
I can only describe it in one word. It says it all. Fantastic!
Vancouver's population was exploding, and with it, real estate values. But despite some xenophobic concerns, the vast majority of new arrivals came from Ontario and Alberta, and all of them potential Straight readers. As its founder and sole proprietor, McLeod had run the Straight with a whim of steel. But as part of his master plan, he now handed over much of his responsibilities to a new editor, ex-Pacific Press writer Charles Campbell.
What the Straight does today, although it's very obviously different in an enormous number of ways, connects with what the Straight did 25 or 30 years ago.
In some ways, it's more like the Georgia Straight was when I started, in the sense of the emphasis they place now on investigative reporting and that kind of journalism. So I think Charles Campbell, all credit to him, I think, has managed to bring the Straight around in that way, editorially, to what it had started out to be.
Dailies have traditionally just been really at sea when it comes to those sorts of things. The entertainment section is viewed as a place for fags and retirees. It's, the calendar is put together by somebody whose Saturday night out is a bridge game after the bake sale. And they don't provide the information that's useful to people that particularly younger people want. I think the Straight just beats the shit out of the competition when it comes to covering musics that are outside of the mainstream. And folk, whether that's the folk festival or the jazz festival, that sort of thing.
Making it work takes a little longer. Making it work takes a little time. Making it work takes a little longer. Making it work takes a little time.
Under Campbell, the Straight's growth was phenomenal.
I think the Straight's revenue growth has been between 20% and 30% per year for a 10-year period.
Rising revenues enabled the new editor to hire more experienced and respected writers. In no time, the paper looked like it could recapture some of its former glories.
Well, I think just almost every week you can see pieces in the Georgia Strait that you won't find anywhere else. That's not necessarily a criticism of the other media in Vancouver, but the Georgia Strait is really the only place left in Vancouver where lengthy, very thoughtful, analytical pieces that reflect upon some of the more interesting questions of the time can be explored.
Being aggressive about sales, having a good sales staff. You know, the Strait has the luxury of a great many very capable sales reps. I don't think we're slaves to our advertisers. Anybody who tells you that editorial and advertising are like church and state is kidding themselves. They're either a dishonest journalist or a fool.
In the 90s, Vancouver continued its ascendancy at breakneck speed. It was becoming the most desirable city in the most desirable country in the world. For the first time, the Strait was winning awards for editorial excellence. The entertainment-only policy had been dropped, and the paper was turning full circle, back to its roots with groundbreaking political and environmental stories and longer in-depth articles. Now it was a multi-million-dollar business, ripe for a takeover. One question remains: how long can one man avoid being bought out by a national media chain? When a dream becomes a reality, who wins, the dreamer or the realist? And which one of these is Dan McLeod? The future of the Georgia Strait is solely in his hands. Since 1967, he has embodied the spirit of the paper through its greatest victories and most humiliating retreats. He has certainly earned the enviable position he's in today.
In the 60s and early 70s, there were over 400 underground press syndicate papers, and the Georgia Strait is the only one left.
When it comes down to it, despite all the names you've mentioned, it's one man's thing. And though he's been ably supported and abetted by the supporting cast, it's been down to Dan. But it survived because of a core of people who still share the same ideals. And it's, I think, an object lesson in growing old disgracefully.
Yesterday, a big shot publisher was sitting in that chair asking me to sell. You know, so it happens all the time. You know, but I used to take it very seriously. I used to say, well, you know, if they're going to offer me some crazy amount of money that's worth way more than it's worth, you know, then why shouldn't I? But now I've decided, like, even if they do offer more than it's worth, I don't feel like, I don't want to.
For tens of thousands of readers and scores of Strait contributors, past and present, the sale of the newspaper to a major chain would be a disaster.
I mean, I think one of the things that has allowed the Georgia Strait to be what it has become is the fact that it is an independent newspaper. You know, if it did fall into the hands of a chain, and if it became simply a franchise, there's a very significant threat that what it has represented would clearly vanish.
Given that I was part of the crew and that we all had one objective, that this thing that we liked very much can indeed be a very successful medium and little ship that we were all bobbing about on the sort of waves of the zeitgeist on.
For the Strait to lose its independent voice and have its content dictated from a boardroom in Toronto or New York could represent a tragic loss, not only for the paper, but for the city of Vancouver itself.
I want to see the Georgia Strait continue to thrive and grow, and as an independent voice, not part of some chain where, who knows what could befall it. So I'm good for a while yet.